a scholar who has taught and lectured at universities around the world and whose writings have been translated into several languages. Dr. Sowell has been a consultant to administrations of both political parties and has served as a scholar in residence at 3 think tanks. Dr. Sowell has written numerous books on economics, social issues, and public policy. One of his books, A Conflict of Visions, was provided to our seminar attendees to help them understand the underlying assumptions that produce political clashes and that guide the course of history. By the way, Dr. Sowell considers that to be his best book, so seminar attendees, you have his greatest work. Most of you here tonight probably know of Dr. Sowell through his syndicated newspaper column, as well as his column published in Forbes magazine, where he is a contributing editor. Dr. Sowell has been described as one of only a handful of thinkers who have the ability to look at the same facts as others, yet conceive webs of explanation that are much more subtle, sophisticated, and accurate than those of his lessers. In describing Dr. Sowell's 1980 book, Knowledge and Decisions, Milton Friedman said it this way, quote, "This is a brilliant book. The ideas are original and penetrating, the examples ingenious and apt, the exposition lucid and absorbing. Professor Sowell illuminates how every society operates. In the process, he also shows how the performance of our own society can be improved." Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce one of America's premier social philosophers and commentators, Dr. Thomas Sowell.
Thank you very much. It's almost like getting a sneak preview of my obituary. When I was younger, I used to be embarrassed by generous introductions, but then I realized what the critics were saying, and I realized it all evens out in the long run. I'd like to talk about economic decision-making as distinguished from political decision-making. And I'd like to start off with a definition of an economy. An economy is not just a system for producing goods and services and distributing them, because the Garden of Eden was not an economy, since there was no scarcity. So economics is the study of the use of scarce resources, which have alternative uses. So that rationing is inherent in the circumstances. Competition is inherent in the circumstances. There are people, particularly among intellectuals, who think that competition is one of those things we can choose to have or not have, when in fact the only choice we have is how shall the competition be carried out. The rationing is inherent whether it's under capitalism, socialism, feudalism, or any other kind of method. So scarcity is the first lesson of economics. Now, the first lesson of politics is to forget the first lesson of economics. It's popular to call politics the art of the possible. I call it the art of the plausible, because what you're advocating doesn't have to be possible. The Clinton health care program, for example, is Democratic Senator Patrick Moynihan referred to the statistics and the estimates of the cost of this program as fantasy. But there's no reason why you cannot enact fantasy into law. There are many laws which show fantasy has been enacted. Let me give you a concrete example of what an economy involves, because an economy involves trade-offs. Politics involves solutions, real or imaginary. Some years ago, there was a tragic airplane crash in which a baby was killed by being torn from its mother's arms. In Washington, the answer was quite clear. We must have laws that say that babies cannot be held in mothers' arms in airplanes. They must have their own separate seat where they're strapped in. Fortunately or unfortunately, a couple of economists got hold of this, and they figured out what would be the probable result of such a law. First of all, it means that every couple that's traveling with a baby would have to buy 3 seats instead of 2. And therefore, they would have 50% higher costs of transportation. Now, since to ordinary people in the real world, as distinguished from Washington, money matters. And therefore, some of those people would not fly. Some would take alternative transportation on the ground, almost all of which has a higher fatality rate than airplanes. And so they estimated that in the course of a decade, you would save 1 baby's life, and you would lose the lives of 60 other people, as well as $72 million. So the whole perspective of trade-offs is typically lacking in political decision-making. People ask such questions as, in politics, is nuclear power safe? And the answer is no, because if nuclear power were safe, it would be the only safe thing on the face of the earth. The only question is, compared to what? Compared to hydroelectric dams? Compared to doing without electricity? There's a story which I hope is apocryphal of an economist who was on the street, met a friend who said, "How are you? How's your wife?" To which the economist replied, "Compared to what?" So looking at nuclear power in this way, it is far safer than any alternative method of producing electricity. Someone calculated how many lives are lost for every so many billion kilowatt hours of electricity, because human lives are among the price paid for generating electricity. And having calculated this, they asked how many lives would be lost generating the amount of electricity that would have been generated by 3 Mile Island during the time that it was shut down. And the answer was 52 lives. No lives were lost at 3 Mile Island, even during the, quote, disaster, unquote. 2 people were killed on the highway trying to get away from 3 Mile Island. Someone has calculated the risk to your life of various kinds of activities. Living within 5 miles of a nuclear power plant for half a century represents the same risk to your life as driving 10 miles on the interstate highway, or spending half an hour in a coal mine, or 6 minutes in a canoe. And I think of all the environmentalists in their canoes worrying about nuclear power plants. There's a whole literature about safety. I think the crucial book was Unsafe at Any Speed by Ralph Nader about the Corvair. And the argument was that because the Corvair was a rear-engine car, it had certain safety problems peculiar to that kind of car, and that these problems were disregarded when the car was produced. And of course, he has all the particular individuals who died as a result of these things. And I took a lot of interest in this since I was driving a Corvair at the time. And it's certainly true that there are different handling characteristics to a rear-engine car, which makes it more prone to certain kinds of accidents. But what Nader apparently didn't have time to get around to was that it's less prone to other kinds of accidents. And therefore, no matter where you put the engine, if you put the engine in the front, if you put it on the top or the bottom or either side, it would have some kinds of accidents that it was more likely to have and other kinds that it's less likely to have. And the studies that have been done indicate the Corvair was no more dangerous on net balance than any other car of that era. There are many other areas where the desire for safety, for categorical safety, for solutions, not for trade-offs, affect political decision-making. For example, pharmaceutical drugs and vaccines very often save many thousands of lives. But sometimes the side effects of the drugs or the diseases you catch from the vaccine itself cause crippling illnesses and sometimes fatal illnesses. And of course, if you allow everyone who has suffered these effects to sue the pharmaceutical companies, then of course the pharmaceutical companies have every incentive to cut back on the production of existing drugs and vaccines and to reduce their investment in producing new drugs and new vaccines to find cures for diseases that are killing people today. I'd like to talk a little bit about the whole political mode of decision-making in terms of the patterns that you see in it. There's one pattern in which you generate political support by creating a, quote, crisis, unquote. Now, since all human situations have some negative features to them, nothing is easier than to find something to complain of and to call it a crisis. A crisis does not mean that what you're talking about is any worse than anything else that human beings do. It does not even mean that it's getting worse than it was in the past. In a remarkable number of cases that I've looked at, the thing that is called a crisis has in fact been getting better for years prior to the policies. Now, after you've convinced people there's a crisis, you have your solution. This is sort of a four-stage thing. First comes the crisis, then comes the solution. Typically, the people who advocate this solution will say this will lead to beneficial result A. The critics say this will lead to detrimental result Z. Third stage, they put the policy in, and the result is that it leads to detrimental result Z. The interesting part is the fourth step, where the people who attribute this detrimental result to the policy are accused of being simplistic for ignoring the complexities of the many factors involved. Moreover, the only cure for this new bad situation is more of the same policy. Let me give a couple of examples. First, the war on poverty. Now, the purpose of the war on poverty was not to prove that if you took money from here and put it there would be more money there than there was before. The purpose of the war on poverty was to end dependency on government handouts. That is, you would have an increase in spending and investment, as they say, in these programs, which will then pay off down the road as all the problems that have been forestalled by this wonderful program now begin to subside. You can quote either from Lyndon Johnson or Bill Clinton, depending on who you prefer to quote. Large literature from both sources. And so, and retraining is one of the great magic words in both administrations. You will retrain people, including people who were never trained in the first place, in order to reduce long-term dependency. So the predictions were made that if you had these programs, after some period of years, dependency on the government would decline. And of course, the opposite prediction that dependence on the government would increase. And so the war on poverty was initiated. Dependency increased to, first of all, the situation at the beginning of the crisis. Poverty had been declining in the United States for at least a decade. Dependency on the government to stay out of poverty had been declining for at least a decade prior to the war on poverty. Dependency on government began to increase almost immediately. As of today, there are more people in poverty than there were in 1964, despite literally trillions of dollars spent. And the only cure is more of the same. Example 2, sex education. Now, the goal of sex education was to prevent teenage pregnancy and venereal disease. And this was, of course, a crisis. Now, for those of us who tend towards skepticism, if we look back at the actual data, we find that teenage pregnancy was declining for more than a decade prior to the introduction of sex education into the public school systems. By 1968, half of all the public schools in the United States had sex education. During the 1970s, the other half kicked in.